So, despite some strong elements here and there, Carole Tuesday ultimately turned out to be a huge disappointment for me. Every Shinichiro Watanabe title so far has left me quite gratified from start to finish, so seeing this one flounder about really left a bad taste in my mouth. There's a whole slew of reasons why I dislike it, but I want to start with the one that sits at the core of this series and why it seemed to buckle under its own weight, that being how highly it thinks of its titular protagonists. This show seems very intent on portraying the main duo as being all-important and vital to the world that they inhabit. The most obvious example is how almost every episode starts with this narration about an event called the Miraculous 7 Minutes, and how these two put it into motion. I know it's not uncommon for anime to have repeated introductions like this, but it's this specific intro combined with the rest of the narrative that I have a gripe with. They can't just be two up-and-coming artists who want to share their music with the world. They're framed as being some of the most important artists of all time, and their actions as artists have a massive impact on the world. Now, it's not impossible to set up your characters like this, but the problem is that, aside from feeling incredibly pretentious, these words are not supported by the actions within the story. Almost every artist they run into who isn't a straight-up villain is immediately blown away by how sincere and earnest Carole Tuesday's music is, and then they lament about how they've been caught up in the business end of things and become more like cogs in the machine than soulful artists trying to express their feelings. Then, almost as if being purposefully tone deaf, these artists go on stage and play something that's not only incredibly earnest, but completely unlike something that sounds as though it was made to be a hit rather than to be artistic. The show claims that Carole Tuesday are unique and important because they don't rely on AI to write their music, but aside from the genre they write in, their music is not distinguishable enough from the music around them to drive that point home. Most of the other artists sound just as authentic, so this excessive praise heaped on the protagonists feels insincere. Now sure, I could just skip the intro and not be reminded of these lines, but the mere act of doing so reminds me why I have to skip it. It's an unavoidable nuisance baked into almost every episode. But the weirdest part is that if the narrative wasn't explicitly telling me this constantly, there's still a chance that I might have actually believed it. The genre that they write in isn't exactly my cup of tea, but I do feel like I'm hearing something incredibly sincere and personal, especially when the cinematography is actually on point instead of totally flat, and the animation isn't completely unsynced from the music. If the story had them slowly impressing more and more people, gradually rising in popularity and fame, then I could have gotten behind this kind of narrative. Now, obviously, that's not how the music industry works. When it comes to recognizable and influential artists, very often you will see people just suddenly explode onto the scene when a big name record decides to back them. One of the neat little anecdotes that my dad shared with me from his time as a musician is that the record industry gives you 18 years to write your first album and 6 months to write your second, because they want you to stay in the public eye as long as possible. This is also why the manager character, Gus, is constantly pushing Carole Tuesday to do these huge stunts to get their name out there, because he knows that as soon as they are in the limelight, they will continue to stay in the limelight as long as they continue to write stuff that the audience can latch onto. And this is really fascinating to me because it displays a very painful identity crisis within the writing. On the one hand, it wants to be this artsy, contemplative story about the perils of the music industry, the struggle to be noticed in an unending sea of entertainment that's being produced faster than it can be consumed, and a conversation about the advances of music writing technology and whether said technology would ever truly replace the quote-unquote human element. But it gets so caught up in its zero-to-hero narrative and constant filleting of the main duo's importance that it never gets to say anything meaningful about these ideas. On the other hand, it also wants to be more anime and be utterly fantastical and awe-inspiring, filling its audience with the hope that one or two people really can make all the difference. It wants to be kinda wacky and incredibly tropey and indulge in concepts that anime fans truly appreciate, but its setting is so far removed from the fantastical that all of these elements feel out of place, and the constant surge of more subtle thematic ideas overwhelm the base narrative and don't give it enough time to be as impacting as it should. For example, episode episodes 7 through 12 are all centered around an American Idol / X Factor / insert comparable reality show here talent competition, but it ends up being structured like a tournament where contestants face off against each other individually rather than as a group. In the first match, Carole and Tuesday face OG Bulldog, who claims to be a hard-as-fuck gangster, but is revealed to be a much more timid and insecure person. Additionally, the music he performs is an extremely gimmicky combination of rap and opera. As such, with Carole and Tuesday's music being based around honest and gimmick-free openness and sincerity, their contradictory natures form a strong thematic clash. However, this contradiction doesn't deliver any more information about the characters or the world they live in other than continuously hammering on about how earnest and sincere the main duo are. It's a strong thematic basis without a conclusion to explain why that basis is there in the first place, and this disconnect is pervasive throughout this arc. In the second round, they face Piotr, who is portrayed as a Logan Paul-esque social media star who only got into music to further increase his popularity. Again, this forms a strong contrast to Carole and Tuesday, who are driven solely by their desire to make music. But once again, them beating Piotr doesn't end up saying anything because Piotr's character is much less clearly defined than just being a clout chaser. One of the judges says that Piotr clearly worked hard on his music and that he put more effort into it than someone who's just looking for another popularity high. So this battle of artificial versus authentic completely collapses because the details end up contradicting this idea. Ironically, making the character less one-dimensional ended up weakening the thematic impact of his existence. You could even argue that this trend continues into the finals when they face off against Angela, whose songs are entirely reliant on AI, an obvious contrast to the main duo's strictly human writing. But the show has almost nothing to say about the concept of AI writing music. As Shonen Ronin points out in his first impression of the series, the initial story setup seems to hint at a conversation about how AI productions have aided in creating a culture of ultra-consumption that lacks deeper human connections, and how artists are progressively putting more and more faith in algorithmic success rather than creating something through their own personal efforts to connect with other people. And he's absolutely right, but unfortunately it almost never touches on this idea again after this initial prompt. The closest it comes to any commentary on this outside of the first episode is when an AI manager steals all of its artists' money and bankrupts him, which, combined with the faulty AI music director in episode 4, jumps well past AI are writing inferior music that creates passive consumers rather than connecting people through art, all the way to AI are evil and we should be wary of them at all times, which is at best completely unintentional, and at worst a gross oversimplification of the impact artificial intelligence has on modern culture. And every time I boot up a new episode, the show is still trying to convince me that these two really are different and that they're going to change the world because they're so authentic and human and everyone else isn't, even though it rarely gives any evidence to support this. I really need to stress that this constant self-praise is one of my biggest sources of grief with this series because it is so fantastical in nature that it completely disrupts the social science fiction setting that the story sets out to build under these more fantastical characters. The biggest difference between the repeated intro scene in Carole and Tuesday and the repeated intros in something like My Hero Academia that constantly tell us how Deku is going to be the greatest hero of all time is that A, Hiroaka is a fantasy through and through, one of almost mythological proportions, and B, it takes great pains to show us that Deku is special even amongst thousands of talented prospective heroes, and that his attitude actually is changing the world of heroics by winning others over to his way of thinking and helping to usher in a new wave of heroes. A far cry from Carole and Tuesday's superficial and honestly kinda selfish take on the one man changes society trope. The more I think about Carole and Tuesday, the more it comes across as massively self-aggrandizing, to the point of fetishizing the impact art has on society. Their music is so important and so pure that it can literally shape the direction society will go in, trumping all other complex social factors in favor of an uber-saccharine story about two artists basically being the second coming of Christ because their music was supposedly more authentic and human than everyone else's because they wrote it themselves and not with an AI. And that's unbearably gaudy to me. Does that mean that Carole Tuesday is completely without value? Definitely not. In fact, I think episode 15 is surprisingly strong despite a few slip-ups and can easily be watched on its own. I could probably also recommend episode 4 purely on its storyboards because Tensai Okamura, but as far as the project overall, it's a major letdown that gradually drifts from mildly annoying to outright infuriating as the story travels further up its own ass and, ironically, further away from anything that could connect with a human audience. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rorkton Joing, Christine Seibert, Call Me Catlord, Ryan Johnson, Jennifer Spencer, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.